Well, as you know, I'm sure, December 10th is the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's recognized properly, I think, as the human rights standard. It's part of what's called customary international law, recognized by U.S. courts. As in the case of other elements of international law, there's no enforcement mechanism apart from the hardly satisfactory mechanism that's provided by the operative principle of international affairs, namely the rule of force. The point was captured rather accurately by a 17th century popular poet. He described laws as like spider webs. He said, lesser flies are quickly taken while the great break out again, which incidentally rhymes in 17th century English, but, but you get the point. In this respect, human rights conventions are, and international law in general, are quite different from the so-called free trade agreements, or what the Wall Street Journal more honestly calls free investment agreements. For these, they impose harsh sanctions for non-compliance. That's a crucial part of the World Trade Organization regime. Here too, in fact, the great break out again when they choose, but the sanctions do exist and they're sometimes applied. In contrast, human rights conventions carry no penalties at all for violation. That distinction reflects the ranking of the rights of investors versus the rights of ordinary people in the prevailing doctrinal systems. It's one of many illustrations of that same fact, of the rule of force in international affairs. Another illustration of that is prosecution for war crimes or crimes against humanity. In this case, only the weak and the defeated need apply. Furthermore, that's a matter of principle. It was explained rather clearly by Telford Taylor. He was the chief counsel for the prosecution at Nuremberg. About 30 years ago, he wrote a book, some of you will remember, on Nuremberg and Vietnam, in which he raised the question whether the Nuremberg principles would apply to the U.S. conduct of the war in Vietnam. And in it, he considered the question whether the bombing of North Vietnam can be counted a war crime. He recognized and reported that the bombing was devastating near the major urban centers where there were diplomats and journalists and Russian ships in the harbor and so on. There was a certain degree of protection, but elsewhere, you don't have to go very far away to see that much of the country was turned into a moonscape, particularly below the 20th parallel. And Taylor was well aware of that, but he pointed out, and quite accurately, that aerial bombardment, no matter how devastating, is not a war crime by the standards of Nuremberg. And he also gave the reasons. As, quote him, he said, the Allies had played the terrible game even more successfully than the Germans, and therefore it would have been inequitable to charge the Nazis with crimes. Of course, it would have been equitable to charge everyone with crimes, but that was never considered, and he doesn't mention that possibility. Similarly, he points out that German admirals were exonerated from war crimes on the basis of testimony by U.S. Admiral Nimitz, who testified that the U.S. Navy had committed the same crimes, so therefore they weren't crimes. The operational definition of a war crime, as according to the Nuremberg principles, are that war crimes are crimes that somebody else committed against us, but that we didn't commit against them, or at least we can claim we didn't. In this respect, war crimes are very much like terrorism. Terrorism is terrorism that's carried out by them against us, whoever we happen to be. Our crimes are, in contrast, self-defense. Again, that holds whoever we happen to be. You can try it out. I think you'll find that it's a historical universal, and it's transmuted by power into history in another in a very specific way. That's another near universal. Notice that Taylor was talking about crimes in North Vietnam, bombing of North Vietnam. He never raised the question of the bombing of South Vietnam, which was far more intense and destructive and began much earlier. South Vietnam was also subjected to lots of other crimes that were never used in the North. For example, chemical warfare. Plenty of people still dying from it. Destruction of dams, it's another war crime under Nuremberg principles, and lots of other crimes. But the South was completely defenseless, so therefore the attackers are totally immune, at least within their own doctrinal systems, ours. So there was no protest. In contrast, the North had some defenses. As I mentioned, there was an international presence, and also they had anti-aircraft weapons supplied by the Russians, which was condemned here as a crime of the Russians. But the South was totally defenseless, and therefore the attack is completely carried out with total impunity. It was never much of an issue, the bombing of South Vietnam, even in the peace movement. There was almost no protest prior to 1965. That was before the bombing of North Vietnam started, when it was only the South that was getting destroyed and hundreds of thousands of people killed. So that wasn't a case of protest, again, because it was defenseless. One of the most interesting aspects of the Pentagon Papers is a comparison of the planning for bombing of the North and the South. With regard to the bombing of the North, if you read through the internal documents, there's very meticulous, careful planning, just how far can you go without too much of a cost and so on. In the case of the bombing of the South, there's nothing. There's just no planning. You just announce, every once in a while you announce it or do it, but it makes sense because there's no cost. So therefore it's completely free. You can bomb at will. And the same is true of the huge literature on the war in Vietnam. It's enormous. But it almost never raises the question of the bombing of South Vietnam or any other major atrocities carried out in the South, because they're just normal. They're costless, and therefore they carry no stigma. These are facts that tell you quite a lot about the values that we're supposed to uphold, and all are matters that bear quite directly on the question of human rights and international law in the real world. Another illustration of that, current illustration, is given, again, pretty graphically by the two major crimes that brought the 20th century to kind of a fitting end. One is the Serbian crimes in Kosovo. The other are the simultaneous Indonesian crimes in East Timor. By any reasonable standard, the second are far worse, but only the first is punished, or for that matter, even investigated. So immediately after the bombing of Serbia ended, Kosovo was teeming with investigators, forensic investigators, attempting to find any shred of evidence they could about crimes that could be attributed to the Serbs. But forensic investigators were withheld from East Timor, despite the pleas of the United Nations, Timorese, and others. Why the difference? Well, it's pretty simple. In East Timor, the crimes can be traced right back to Washington and London, very easily, in fact, and they are, of course, immune by virtue of the rule of force. So therefore, inquiry would be totally inappropriate, and the lack of inquiry, again, passes without notice. Similarly, there's a huge literature and vast indignation about Kosovo, but virtually nothing about East Timor, and that little is never reviewed or mentioned. And again, that reflects the same distinction. If 80,000 Kosovars were right now rotting in Serbian concentration camps, many dying every day, we'd know about it. In fact, we'd probably go to war. That's in fact happening right now with regard to the Timorese, but there's total silence, and for the same reasons. In fact, even the case of Kosovo reflects those crucial distinctions. So if you have a look, say, at the indictment of Milosevic for crimes in Kosovo, the indictment is interesting. The crimes are virtually without exception. The crimes that he's charged with are after the bombing, and it's surely in reaction to it. The reason for that, the indictment was based on the very rich record of U.S. and British intelligence. By now, a lot of that's been made public, including a ton of other documentation from NATO and State Department and other Western sources. And what it reveals is very clear. Up until a couple of months before the bombing, about January, the British, who were the super hawks in the alliance, attributed most of the crimes there to the rebels, to the guerrillas attacking Kosovo from across the border. And in the months that followed, nothing changed, at least according to the voluminous record that's provided by the West. For this reason, this entire documentary record, which is extremely rich, is totally ignored in the literature on the topic. Take a look and see. But because then, after the bombing, or after the withdrawal of the monitors by the U.S. over Serbian objections, and then the bombing immediately, then the crimes really start. So that's what the indictment is. Of course, there's a small corollary to that. It means that the responsibility for those crimes is actually shared, since they're a direct consequence of the bombing. It doesn't exonerate the crimes, but tells you a little about the responsibility. But none of this is mentionable either. This is off the record for the same reasons. What about NATO war crimes? They certainly took place during the bombing, but they can't be investigated either. The International Tribunal did briefly make some gestures about investigating them, but they were quickly called off. The reasons were explained rather neatly by a U.S. senator who was asked about it on a visit to Canada. He said, he was asked what would happen if the International Tribunal investigated NATO crimes in the bombing of Serbia, and he pointed out that if that ever happened, the United Nations buildings in New York would be taken apart brick by brick and thrown into the Atlantic Ocean, which sort of captures the point pretty accurately. That again captures the essence of international law in the real world. Well, it's easy enough to continue, and I won't go on with that. But these are background realities that we just can't ignore in considering human rights and international law, at least if we're trying to be serious about the topic. For the same reasons, the doctrines and the practices of the United States are of paramount importance for the entire world. Economically speaking, the world is kind of tripolar, as it's called, with three major power centers, roughly comparable in Asia, Europe, and North America. But in terms of the means of violence, it's radically unipolar. It's all concentrated in one place. And that means what happens there is of enormous significance for everyone. And most emphatically, it's of enormous significance for us for two obvious reasons. For one thing, we happen to be here, so therefore we're responsible for what happens. And for another, happens to be a country that's remarkably free by comparative standards. So therefore, what we do or what we don't do has a very great impact. And it follows that the moral responsibility is comparably great, again, if we're trying to be serious. If we want to join the mainstream, we pick a different perspective. The opposite one, again, a historical universal. Well, assuming elementary moral principles, let's take a look at the official U.S. attitudes towards international law and human rights, and then a little bit at corresponding practice. With regard to international law, there's no ambiguity at all. The attitude is very clear. Perhaps the clearest example, which happens to be highly pertinent right now for a number of reasons, is a Security Council resolution of 1986. the resolution called on all states to observe international law. That's it. It was vetoed by the United States, which therefore stands alone in declaring that states, meaning one state, doesn't have to observe international law. That was then reiterated at the General Assembly for successive years. The votes were again almost unanimous. The United States and one or two client states opposed. In these resolutions, no state was mentioned, but everybody knew who was meant. It was intended, it was aimed at the United States, and the reason was because of the judgment of the International Court of Justice, the World Court, shortly before, which had condemned the United States for the unlawful use of force, meaning international terrorism, in its war against Nicaragua. The United States incidentally stands alone in the world in having been condemned by the World Court for international terrorism and by the Security Council in the follow-up resolution that it vetoed, so it's entirely natural that the United States should be lauded now for leading the war against terrorism, without any reference to any of this, of course. The reason for rejecting the World Court decision wasn't just a decision. They ordered the U.S. to desist, to pay reparations. The reaction was to immediately escalate the war. The reason for the rejection of World Court jurisdiction was explained by the State Department legal officer, Abraham Sofer. He reviewed the history of the relation between the United States and the international institutions. He pointed out, he did it accurately, he said that right after the Second World War, we could count on other countries to go along with anything we did. They'd vote with us at the United Nations and so on, for pretty obvious reasons, which he didn't explain, and you don't have to. But as decolonization set in, and the United Nations began to reflect a wider range of opinion, and as Europe and Japan were reconstructed from the war, the United Nations stopped being a reliable instrument of support for U.S. actions. And as a result, he said, we can no longer count on other nations of the world to go along with us when we do something, and therefore we must reserve to ourselves the right to determine when some action is within the domestic jurisdiction of the United States. In this case, the act that was within the domestic jurisdiction of the United States was a terrorist war against Nicaragua. These things ought to be taught in elementary school, in my opinion. They're very great significance for anyone who wants to understand anything about ourselves, which is presumably an important topic. They certainly ought to be headlines right now. It's all very pertinent. For one thing, because the reason I already mentioned, the one state that has declared its immunity to international law and has been condemned for international terrorism is now leading the war on terrorism without any comment. For another, because the actions that Nicaragua took in this case do serve as a precedent as to how to respond to acts of international terrorism, and recall that that was far worse even than the events of September 11th. There are methods to respond by law-abiding states. Nicaragua pursued them, obviously couldn't get anywhere. It was up against a power that doesn't observe any of these rules. But if the United States wanted to pursue those paths, nothing would block it. It was a decision not to pursue them. Well, that's not the only case, neither the first nor the last. Just to take another, there's no one in the United States who's more lauded more effusively for his defense of international law, his lonely battle for international law, than Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Article after article, biography just came out last year which emphasizes it. When he resigned from the Senate a year ago, there was an accolade in the New York Times Magazine by a left liberal writer, Jacob Weisberg, who again praised him for standing up for international law and fighting this lonely, courageous battle at the United Nations, where he was U.S. representative for a while, and he emphasized particularly his tremendous courage in criticizing Idi Amin and defending Israel. That takes a lot of courage in New York. The biography does the same thing. Always pointedly omitted in all of these accolades and praises is the most important action that Moynihan took while he was U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and which he's quite proud of. He describes it in his memoirs. The action, it's actually the most important act of his life in terms of its human consequences by far. The act had to do with the Indonesian invasion of East Timor in December 1975. The invasion was immediately condemned by the Security Council in a resolution unanimously passed calling on Indonesia to terminate the war crime, which is what it is, and the crimes against humanity, which immediately followed, and to withdraw from East Timor. But nothing ever happened, and Moynihan explains why in his memoirs. I'll read it in his words. He said, "The United States wished things to turn out as they did and worked to bring this about. The Department of State desired that the United Nations prove utterly ineffective in whatever measures it undertook. This task was given to me, and I carried it forward with no inconsiderable success." Well, that's true. He also understands the success. He pointed out right away that within the next couple of months, about 60,000 people were killed. And he says it must have ended at that point because it disappeared from the media, which it did, while another 200,000 or so were killed with U.S. arms flowing in, and then the British taking over when the genocide, and that's what it was, really reached a peak, going on until 1999, as I mentioned. Like the remarks of Sofer, these ought to also be committed to memory by anyone who's concerned with international law or human rights, and for that matter, anyone who values their freedom. And it's telling that it's expunged from history, like Sofer's remarks, in fact, like all of these events. In fact, everything I've mentioned, out of history, wrong story. Well, again, those are historical universals, are pretty close when countries are powerful enough to get away with it, and when the intellectual culture is subservient enough to play that game, as it usually is. Actually, none of this is really left to inference. It's all stated pretty clearly. So Dean Acheson, elder statesman who's an advisor to the Kennedy administration, gave an important talk before the American Society of International Law in 1963, in which he explained, I'll quote him, that if there is a challenge to the power, position, and prestige of the United States, then the propriety of the U.S. response is not a legal issue. He said that international law has its points. He said it's useful to gild our positions with an ethos derived from very general moral principles which have affected legal doctrines, but that's it. It's not to be adhered to be used as a weapon or to gild our positions. The supreme cynicism of these remarks derives from authentic power. For someone like Acheson, there's no need to resort to the kinds of pretenses that deface intellectual journals and journals of opinion, commentary generally, academic writing, and so on. And he can just tell the truth, and nobody cares. That's good. He should. Nice to hear it straight out of the horse's mouth. The internal record, if you bother to look at it, is exactly the same, and that goes way back to the beginning. The National Security Council was formed, established in 1947, just at the time of the founding of the United Nations and the UN Charter, which outlawed the threat of use of force in international affairs. The first memorandum of the National Security Council in 1947 was concerned, NSC 1, was concerned with Italy. There was a lot of worry about Italy at the time. There was a powerful anti-Nazi resistance in Italy, worker-based, that in fact liberated most of the country. The first act of the British and the Americans who entered Italy from the south and then went up to the north was to disband and dismantle the resistance and to restore the fascist structures. But still, they were the labor-based resistance movement was quite strong and had a lot of prestige. There was an election coming up in 1948, and it was very likely that the communists who were based on it would win the election, which caused a lot of problems. That's what NSC-1 was about. At that point, the U.S. thought it probably had a way to control the elections, namely by withholding food. The country was starving, by reinstating the fascist police to break strikes and so on. It was all pretty powerful weapons, but they weren't sure they were going to work. So NSC-1 discusses what would happen if the communists took power by legal means in a democratic election, and it determines, this is internal records later declassified, that in that case the U.S. would declare a national emergency, put the Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean on alert, and begin to support paramilitary activities inside Italy to overthrow the government. That's NSC-1, exactly at the time when the U.S. and other countries were declaring solemnly that the threat of use of force in international affairs is illegitimate. Not everyone agreed. In the internal deliberations, George Kennan, who's considered the leading humanist in the system, he was opposed to that because he thought they ought to take much harsher measures. He thought that they ought to carry out these measures even before the election, just not to take a chance. But he was sort of quieted down and convinced that other measures like starvation and violence would probably work to swing the election, as indeed they did. Well, that's NSC-1, and the practice continues. We've actually just seen a rather striking example of it, namely the bombing of Afghanistan. Rather pointedly, the United States did not request, in fact refused to request Security Council authorization for that, which would have made it legitimate, right or wrong is another question, but legitimate at least within the framework of international law. There's a lot of debate about whether the ambiguous resolutions actually justify the bombing, but it's all beside the point, because it all could have been clarified very easily just by asking for a resolution to endorse the bombing, which would have certainly passed. The 5 countries with a veto wouldn't have vetoed it. Britain reflexively goes along with the United States. France has enough of an imperial legacy so that it certainly wouldn't object to bombing some third world country. As for Russia and China, they're very enthusiastic about the bombing because they're seeking U.S. endorsement and authorization for their own massive atrocities in Chechnya and Western China. So therefore they're delighted in principle to support this. So there was no chance of a veto, but the U.S. just did not want the authorization for very good reasons. If you ask for authorization for an act, that implies that you need authorization, that you're not entitled to use violence at will. And it's not a wise move to do that. I mean, if you're, say, a mafia don and you want to collect protection money from someone, you don't get a court order. That would, even if you could, I mean, that would entail that you need some authority. And a really lawless, violent state that's committed with determination to act like an international mafia don is right to reject authorization. There's even a word for it in the international affairs literature. It's called maintaining credibility. You have to maintain credibility. People have to be afraid of you. That was actually the only that was the official reason, both by Britain and the United States, for bombing Serbia, to maintain credibility. There were other reasons, but they weren't serious. And it's for the same reason the United States refused to seek extradition of Osama bin Laden and his associates. They might have been able to get it. The Taliban, in fact, offered it, but that was rejected summarily without comment, with total ridicule. And the U.S. didn't want extradition because extradition, to ask for extradition, again, entails that there's some authority that might rule on whether what you do is legitimate. And if you're the world ruler, you don't want you don't want any implication that there is such an authority. Well, all of that tells us quite a lot about international law. And you can kind of measure the significance that's given to international law and the intellectual culture by asking how often any of this comes up. The answer to that inquiry is 0, which tells you something. I'll put this aside, but let me just give you one last example. The last example is happens to be current, yesterday, in fact. It has to do with the Fourth Geneva Convention. The Fourth Geneva Convention was executed in 1949. Its purpose was to formally criminalize the acts of the Nazis in occupied territories, Nazi-occupied territories. The world power that has international responsibility for the Fourth Geneva Convention is Switzerland. It's what's called the depository power. And the International Committee of the Red Cross, based in Switzerland, is the responsible authority. Along with the rest of the world, the ICRC and Switzerland have repeatedly determined that the Fourth Geneva Convention applies to the Israeli-occupied territories. Israel alone votes against this in international forums. The U.S. abstains, not wanting to take such a clear position in violation of fundamental principles of international law, particularly given the circumstances that these were principles passed to criminalize Nazi atrocities. Switzerland, a couple of weeks ago, called for a meeting of the contracting parties on the Geneva Convention for December 5th, and it took place yesterday, to consider the application of the principles once again to the occupied territories. Notice that's highly relevant today. Notice also that they didn't call for a meeting of the high contracting parties because the U.S. refused to attend. It rejected its clear obligations under international law. All the high contracting parties, including the United States, are obligated to enforce the convention. The meeting took place. It was unreported in the United States. It was reported. I had a friend of mine did me a favor and did a database check of today's papers around the world. It was reported in the English-speaking world with one exception, the usual one. It's pretty difficult to miss the importance of this at the present moment, and it's another quite clear indication of the significance of international law and human rights in the elite intellectual culture. Well, again, easy to give lots of other examples. Let me just give one last one, because I got time, because it's interesting. There's a list of terrorist states. One of the terrorist states is Cuba. Nicaragua almost became a terrorist state. The United States warned a couple of weeks ago that if the population voted for the Sandinistas in the election that just took place, Nicaragua would also be identified as a terrorist state. To be identified as a terrorist state by the United States is no joke. A lot of things follow from that. So the population of Nicaragua understood the point and voted the right way, so we're all praising the election as a free election. Notice that, all of this passes without comment. The United States was condemned by the World Court and the Security Council for terrorism against Nicaragua, but it's determining that Nicaragua is a terrorist state, and nobody notices anything. Same with Cuba. Cuba is a terrorist state. Why? Well, because for 40 years the United States has been carrying out terrorist acts against Cuba, beginning in October 1959. In fact, Cuba has been the target of more terrorism than probably any other country in the world, maybe all countries combined. So therefore it's a terrorist state. And these crimes are not small. Just about a year ago, about 1,000 pages of documentation declassified documents were released from the Kennedy years. That's when the major atrocities started and took place. And there are a lot of them are about what's called Operation Mongoose, Kennedy's terrorist operations against Cuba, which were quite serious. They were known to be serious. These documents give more information about it. What's particularly interesting about the documents actually was pointed out by Harvard professor Jorge Dominguez in a review of the documents in the main professional journal, Diplomatic History. He pointed out that he's very anti-Cuba, incidentally. I think he's a Cuban exile, in fact, but a good scholar. He pointed out that in 1,000 pages of documents, which describe in some detail pretty serious atrocities, he said he could only find one phrase that raised the question of whether there was anything wrong with carrying out terrorist atrocities in Cuba. That was by a kind of a low-level staff officer who raised the question of whether it might harm U.S. interests if the crimes were exposed, and he was dismissed. The rest of the 1,000 pages don't mention it, and the historical record doesn't mention it. And no one bats an eyelash when Cuba is identified as a terrorist state by the state that has been carrying out terrorist actions against it for 40 years, some of them quite serious. One, in fact, came pretty close to leading to a nuclear war. Again, that's just normal practice, and it reflects the prevailing attitudes towards international law and human rights. The scholarly literature, incidentally, is quite the same. If you look at the standard scholarly histories of terrorism by, say, Walter Lacour or Paul Wilkinson and others, you'll find, if you take a look in the index, you'll find that Cuba is listed. If you look up a lot of listings for Cuba, you check them out, and you'll find that each listing is of an allegation that Cuba might have been involved in supporting a terrorist act somewhere, or else it has to do with Cuban support for Angola when it was resisting South African attacks that were murderous and destructive and happened to be backed by the United States and England, so they're not terrorist acts. That's Cuban terrorism. But what you won't find is any reference to the uncontroversial record of U.S. terrorism against Cuba. That's not listed. Again, standard scholarly practice. Well, let me say a couple things about human rights. It's not very easy to be all that optimistic about the world and about the directions into which it's heading, but there are encouraging developments, and we shouldn't forget them. One very promising tendency is the slow evolution over the years of a kind of a human rights culture among the general population. That accelerated quite sharply in the 1960s. The popular ferment of those years had a notable civilizing effect on the society in many respects. We see that at MIT. If you look at the composition of the student body today, it's quite different from what it was 40 years ago, as is the character of relations among students and faculty and among students and so on. These things are quite important. One significant feature was a greatly heightened concern for human rights. That includes rights of minorities, of women, rights of future generations. That's the driving force behind the environmental movement, which became quite important in the following years. There's also been considerable progress in formulating universal standards of human rights. Actually, the Universal Declaration of 1948 is the most noteworthy example, but there are others. Unfortunately, it's necessary to stress the word formulating. Implementation is quite a different matter. The way the system works, the Universal Declaration is a statement of principles only. The principles become applicable by means of what are called enabling conventions that are supposed to be established by the General Assembly. And these have to be signed and ratified by states to become applicable to them. Furthermore, even if they are signed and ratified, that has no force unless the conventions are actually applied. And at this point, since there's no enforcement mechanisms, we turn to the responsibilities of citizens. They have the responsibility of ensuring that the fine words do not remain what James Madison once called a mere parchment barrier in the way of tyranny and oppression. So they have to compensate for the lack of external enforcement mechanisms, which is the only way to give any substance to these pronouncements. Well, the extent to which this responsibility is undertaken is another measure of the commitment to international law and human rights. I'm not going to pursue that. I'll leave that as an exercise, and it's a useful one for those who want to learn something about ourselves. Stress again that a profound flaw in the international system and an indication of the fragility of the commitment to human rights is the fact that the enabling conventions are toothless, even when they're ratified. Human rights are, as I mentioned, assigned a far lower value than the rights of investors and lenders. So corporations are granted extraordinary rights in current international investor rights agreements, far beyond ordinary persons. They had already been granted the rights of persons a century ago through radical judicial activism, and these rights were then conferred not on the corporation but on the corporate management that created a new absolutism, in the words of the leading legal historian of the process of transformation of American law, to transfer effective power to private tyrannies that are scarcely accountable to the public. That's Morton Horowitz of Harvard Law School. In the new international economic order today, these rights are extended far beyond those of persons. So General Motors, for example, can claim what's called national treatment in Mexico, but if a Mexican person of flesh and blood were to demand national treatment in Texas after crossing the border, assuming he made it alive, he wouldn't make out very well. The private tyrannies can also bring suit against governments to undermine regulations that were established to protect health or safety or the environment. And they can do that on the ground that the regulations may restrict their future profits. They are, technical terms, tantamount to expropriation under fanciful new legal doctrines of regulatory taking that have been created by ultra-right radical judicial activism. These aren't abstract possibilities. They've already been implemented, and the corporations win in the panels of trade representatives that operate in secret without rules of evidence or other judicial constraints. Persons of flesh and blood have no comparable rights. So it's not correct anymore to say that corporations have the rights of immortal persons. It's way beyond that in current legal doctrine. These recently concocted rights of investors and lenders, they are guaranteed by severe sanctions. Human rights can be freely violated with no penalty in the international system. There's no enforcement mechanism, just as there's none for the Geneva Conventions. There are for investor rights agreements, but even these enforcement regimes can hardly claim the mantle of justice. So, for example, the United States can threaten and indeed implement, if it wants, sanctions against Haiti, poorest country in the hemisphere, forcing it, as it has, to accept a flood of U.S. rice from agribusiness corporations that rely on massive public subsidies for about 40% of their profits, in fact, which were sponsored with particular enthusiasm by self-declared conservatives, notably the Reagan administration. The policies that are extended by their successors have had very substantial effects in Haiti. They've destroyed the livelihood of the farmers who produce the primary subsistence crop in the poorest country of the hemisphere. In principle, Haiti can also threaten sanctions against the United States. That's permitted. For example, for subsidizing its rice exports, which is against World Trade Organization rules. Or, for example, for extradition. Haiti's been trying for years to extradite a major war criminal, Emmanuel Constant. He's a leading figure in the slaughter of maybe 4,000 to 5,000 people a few years ago, during the Clinton years. This was under a military junta that had enjoyed the tacit support of the first Bush and the Clinton administrations, while it tortured and murdered on a pretty impressive scale. Constant has already been sentenced by a court in Haiti, but in absentia, the U.S. refuses to surrender him, probably concerned about what he might reveal if he's brought to trial in person. And this is not the only such case. The refusal of a great power to extradite major criminals is routine, and it's so uncontroversial that it's unreported and unknown, as in this case. even though it's constantly reiterated. Now, that's true even when the request for extradition for major crimes is when it's requested by states that have long been allies and models of democracy, like Costa Rica, for example, particularly if the crimes would implicate the United States, as in that case they surely would. Haiti, Costa Rica, Cuba, Nicaragua, and others can, in principle, invoke sanctions against the United States. In the case of Costa Rica and Nicaragua, they could even appeal to an explicit decision of the World Court. But those are formal rights. They don't rise even to the level of ridicule in the real world. And that's why they're unmentioned and not part of history. Well, it's unnecessary to add, or it should be, that when the weak and defenseless suddenly become an official enemy, then the rules change quite radically. So when they offer to extradite a suspected criminal but ask for evidence first, that request is dismissed with total contempt, and the guardians of civilization react by driving miserable and entirely innocent people to mass starvation and death, always accompanied by ringing pronouncements of the unchallengeable justice of their cause on the part of distinguished intellectuals. I'm describing the last few weeks. Familiar. It takes a certain dedication to miss these salient features of past and present history. Well, with all of its serious flaws, the Universal Declaration does stand as an important achievement, and it should be regarded, I think, as a benchmark for future progress. There are, however, a number of illusions about it that ought to be dismantled. One illusion is that it's an expression of Western imperialism, that is, reflecting narrow, specific Western values. The history of the Universal Declaration reveals clearly that that's not the case. It had extensive contributions from Asian participants, roots in Asian cultures, and particularly in the anti-colonial and anti-fascist struggles that were dominant popular forces at the time. Asian relativists cannot reasonably plead that they were excluded and that the Universal Declaration is a form of Eurocentric cultural imperialism. That's just not true. Another illusion is that it's only Asian relativists who reject the universality of the Universal Declaration, which is defended with vigor and courage by the West, primarily its stalwart leader. That's a staple of Western commentary. I'll skip quotes, but it hardly withstands scrutiny. The Soviet representative, UN representative, Andrei Vyshinsky, he formally accepted the Universal Declaration, but he was kind of like Dean Acheson. He said why. He said it's just a collection of pious phrases, so he was able to accept it. And those cynical words are widely quoted in the West, but not those of Reagan's UN ambassador, Jeane Kirkpatrick, who derided the Universal Declaration as a letter to Santa Claus. Neither nature, experience, nor probability informs these lists of entitlements, which are subject to no constraints except those of the mind and appetite of their authors. Kirkpatrick was referring specifically to the socioeconomic provisions of the Universal Declaration. They have exactly the same status as all others, but they're irrelevant because they're rejected by the leaders of the free world quite explicitly. That's one of the reasons why the United States has one of the worst records in the world, even informally ratifying enabling conventions. And in fact, it's actually ratified none. Even the few that have been ratified have crucial reservations, and they're conditioned as inapplicable to the United States. They're non-self-executing in technical terms. You may have noticed this 2 years ago when Yugoslavia, in the middle of the bombing, brought to the World Court a charge of genocide against NATO. Charge is absurd, but what was interesting is that the United States didn't argue against the charge. It simply argued before the court successfully that the U.S. wasn't subject to that charge because the World Court rules require that parties to a dispute both have accepted the principle. And when the U.S. finally did ratify the Genocide Convention after about 40 years, it specifically excluded itself from the charge. So therefore, the charge can't be brought against the United States in an international tribunal, and it was absolved correctly. U.S. opposition to the socioeconomic provisions is quite profound. The leading academic specialist on this topic, Philip Alston, he points out that after a brief detour under popular pressure in the 1970s, under Reagan, U.S. human rights policy, I'm quoting him, returned to the unqualified rejection of economic, social, and cultural rights as rights. And he quotes a high State Department official concerned with human rights and humanitarian affairs, Paula Dobriansky. She wrote to dispel what she called myths concerning human rights, the first of which is that the so-called economic and social rights constitute human rights. We say that the Universal Declaration is inapplicable, and therefore it's inapplicable by virtue of the rule of force again. George Bush I's ambassador, Morris Abram, he reaffirmed that stand. He described ideas formulated in the Universal Declaration as little more than an empty vessel into which vague hopes and inchoate expectations can be poured. They're a dangerous incitement and even preposterous. Abrams was explaining, he was addressing the UN Commission on Human Rights when he said that, and he was explaining Washington's rejection of what was called the right to development being debated then. This sought to guarantee, I'm quoting it, it sought to guarantee the right of individuals, groups, and peoples to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy continuous economic, social, cultural, and political development in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be fully realized. The U.S. alone vetoed the declaration, thus implicitly vetoing Article 25 of the Universal Declaration, which it very closely paraphrased. And that position stands, it's also unchallenged and virtually unknown apart from a few specialists. For these reasons alone, the United States is a leader of the relativist camp, rejecting the universality of the Universal Declaration, contrary to the huge literature that you read about this, which blames Asian relativists correctly, but they're not alone. When it serves power interests, the United States does depart from its rejection of the socioeconomic provisions of the Universal Declaration. So in building its case against the eventual use of force against Serbia, Washington submitted to the UN Security Council a resolution stating that deliberate impeding of the delivery of food and medical supplies to civilian populations constitutes violations of international humanitarian law, and those who commit or order the commission of such acts will be held individually responsible in respect of such acts. That's in the case of Serbia. Turning elsewhere, in the case of Cuba alone, every president of the United States since Kennedy is therefore individually responsible for such violations of international humanitarian law. The U.S. sanctions against Cuba are unique in the world in that they do not permit food and medicine to be sent. They impose severe sanctions on that. So it follows from the principle that the U.S. established in the case of Serbia that every single president is subject to prosecution for that, or would be if it were not for the tacit agreement about selective enforcement. And that reigns with such absolute power among Western relativists, including virtually the entire intellectual and academic community, that even the simple facts are virtually undiscoverable, undetectable. You might try and see. Got to work to find them. 2 months ago, 6 weeks ago, on World Food Day, October 15th, the UN Special Rapporteur for the Right to Food, official in charge of the issues of the right to food, Jean Ziegler, he reported that 100,000 people are dying every day from hunger. And this silent genocide, as he called it, is not the result of lack of means. There are ample food supplies. It's the result of lack of will among the wealthy and the powerful, which is all quite accurate. Later, shortly after that, he announced the cancellation of the Second World Food Summit, which was scheduled for last month, for November. He canceled it because of lack of interest among the powerful. The pretty words do appear on paper. With a single exception, the members of the United Nations have formally accepted the principle that the right to adequate food is realized when every man, woman, and child, alone or in community with others, has physical and economic access at all times to adequate food or means for its procurement. It implies, still quoting, the availability of food in a quantity and quality sufficient to satisfy the dietary needs of individuals and acceptable within a culture that is indivisibly linked to the inherent dignity of the human person. But that remains a mere parchment barrier to starvation for almost 1 billion people, and the leader of the free world continues to uphold its principled rejection of the right to food. The U.S. is alone in refusing formally even to endorse this right. Well, all of this, again, passed without notice just in the last few weeks. Also unreported was the plea of the UN Special Rapporteur to the United States to stop the bombing of Afghanistan to permit desperately needed food deliveries to resume. He was echoing the pleas of leading aid organizations, the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and others. Their warnings of a humanitarian catastrophe with millions of people facing starvation and disease were dismissed without comment and scarcely reported. The toll, whatever it'll be, will never be known, and it won't be investigated, at least if the past is any guide. I gave a couple of examples, and for the usual reasons. These are our crimes, therefore they're automatically expunged from history. We can forget about them. The Western powers insist on giving priority to civil and political rights. That's in direct conflict with the Universal Declaration. But there's a good deal of fraud even in that stand. So in fact, they consistently reject these rights, selectively, as they choose. So consider, for example, Article 14 of the Universal Declaration. That declares that everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. That's a core principle of the civil and political rights regime which we claim to uphold. And it's been flatly rejected by every single U.S. administration, including the Carter administration. Notoriously, in the case of refugees from Haiti, they are driven back to their torture chamber by an illegal naval blockade. The United States is joined by every other Western power. Australia, for example, which just recently has been denying asylum to fleeing Afghan refugees. It intercepts them illegally on the high seas. In one particularly ugly recent case, which you probably saw, it shipped them off to a tiny little island, the island of Nauru, which alone was willing to accept its obligations under the Universal Declaration. Prime Minister John Howard of Australia just won re-election by forcefully rejecting Article 14 of the Universal Declaration. That was his main plank. That's a crime against humanity that was hugely popular down under. And the reason is simple. These are just rights of human beings, and they can easily be set aside. That's quite unlike rights of private tyrannies. They have to be safeguarded and defended by every possible means. There's an example of that in this morning's newspaper, if you look. It was announced that this tiny island, Nauru, is being sanctioned or threatened with sanctions because of money laundering, which is harmful to the international financial system. I presume the charges are correct. But notice that Australia faces no charges for violating Article 14 of the Universal Declaration by sending starving refugees off to Nauru, which also receives no benefits from having observed the Universal Declaration. So Afghans who are fleeing from one of the most miserable corners of the world, they can be taken in by Pakistan or Iran, as they have been in the millions, but they can expect nothing from the rich and the powerful, who are incidentally currently destroying what's left of their country And this is true no matter what the Universal Declaration happens to say. The provisions of the Universal Declaration are not very well known in the United States, but some of them are familiar. Undoubtedly the most famous is Article 13, technically Section 2 of Article 13, which states that everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own. That principle was invoked with a great deal of passion every year on Human Rights Day, December 10th, with demonstrations and indignant condemnations of the Soviet Union for its refusal to let Soviet Jews leave in direct violation of Article 13. It's true in Boston too, big demonstrations every year. To be exact, the words that I just quoted were invoked, but not the words that follow. The words that follow are, "and to return to his own country." So everyone has the right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. The significance of the omitted words was spelled out on December 11th, 1948. That's the day after the Universal Declaration was ratified, when the General Assembly unanimously passed Resolution 194, which affirms the right of Palestinians to return to their homes or receive condemnation. It's reaffirmed regularly since. Year after year, the demonstrations, which were often led by distinguished law professors famous for upholding civil rights, omitted the unwelcome phrase, quite confident, correctly, that the press and intellectuals would look the other way, as they invariably did. It obviously simply wouldn't do to bring to light the glaringly obvious fact that those who were exhorting the Soviet tyranny to observe Article 13, to much acclaim, were in fact its most dedicated opponents. The fact is transparent, so transparent that it better not be mentioned, and it was never mentioned. Check and see. It's only fair to add that the cynicism about this has indeed been overcome. At the December 1993 session of the United Nations, the Clinton administration changed official U.S. policy. It joined Israel in opposing UN 194, which was then reaffirmed by a vote of 127 to 2. And as is the norm in such cases, there was no report or no comment. But at least the inconsistency is now behind us. The first half of Article 13 has lost its relevance with the disappearance of the Soviet Union, and Washington now officially rejects the second half, so no inconsistency any longer. That too has human consequences, which are very evident today. I don't have to talk about it. Other rights that fall within the civil and political regime are formulated in Articles 17 and 19 and 21. They guarantee the right to receive and impart information and ideas through any media, and to take part in genuine elections that ensure that the will of the people will be the basis of the authority of government. It's long been recognized that state power is not the only form of interference with the fundamental right to receive and impart information and ideas. And in the industrial democracies, it's not the most important one by a long shot. Those are matters that have been quite prominently discussed by John Dewey and George Orwell, to mention only two examples. In 1946, there was a prestigious commission, the Hutchins Commission on Freedom of the Press, established. It warned that private agencies controlling the great mass media constitute a fundamental threat to freedom of the press, with their ability to impose an environment of vested beliefs and bias as a commercial enterprise under the influence of advertisers and owners. The European Commission of Human Rights has endorsed that principle and recognized excessive concentration of the press as an infringement of the rights guaranteed by Article 19, calling on all states to prevent these abuses, a position that's also been endorsed by Human Rights Watch and other human rights organizations. Well, the significance of that is pretty clear without bothering with any comment for elections as well. The enormous importance of maintaining monopoly power over expression was demonstrated when UNESCO, about 20 years ago, tried to democratize the media by initiating what was called a new international information order. It was based on the idea that the South should be able to participate in the international media, breaking the Western monopoly. The United States government and the media bitterly condemned UNESCO. There was a very impressive flood of deceit and lies, uncorrectable, reiterated without change after refutation, which was very rarely permitted expression. This is quite a record, actually. It was summed up by an academic historian of the U.S. UNESCO relations, William Preston. He writes that the stunning irony of this achievement was that the United States, having proved that the free market in ideas did not exist, attacked UNESCO for planning to destroy it, and in fact proceeded virtually to destroy UNESCO. There's a detailed review of media and government deceit published by University of Minnesota Press, also been ignored. That history provides a very revealing measure of the attitudes toward the basic principles of freedom and democracy, and it would be of great value to those who are concerned with the nature of free expression and how it's defended and upheld in a free society. I presume that's why it's not reviewed and unknown. And there are, again, recent examples. NATO bombed and destroyed Serbian TV for a simple reason. It refused to accept a demand that it run 6 hours of NATO propaganda every day. So therefore it was bombed and destroyed, and that's not considered a crime. Just recently, Al Jazeera, the one independent news channel in the Arab world, which has been bitterly attacked by the Arab countries because it exposes their crimes all the time. Just recently it was called on by the U.S. government, by Colin Powell, to stop preventing what the U.S. regards as unacceptable propaganda, that is, things that don't fall within the right framework. The Emir of Qatar happened to be in Washington at the time, and he called a press conference in which he informed the press that Qatar was going to defend the freedom of the press against the United States and not rein in Al Jazeera, which is based there. That passed without report, except in the Wall Street Journal, which had a good report on it. Same thing happened in Pakistan. I just happened to be there a couple days ago. The Pakistani press reported that the U.S. ambassador, Wendy Chamberlain, had essentially ordered the Pakistani government to prevent the Taliban embassy, they had an embassy there, to prevent them from holding news conferences on the grounds that the ambassador at the news conferences was telling lies, as she put it. I'm sure she's right. And Pakistan, of course, agreed. The principle is that only our lies should be permitted expression in the free market of ideas. And that too passes without any comment. The records of Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International provide ample and compelling evidence that what I've just said barely scratches the surface with regard to civil and political rights. Regrettably, the human rights organizations generally adhere to Western practice in largely ignoring the other provisions of the Universal Declaration. But these few examples should suffice to make it clear that while Asian relativism is very real and completely disgraceful, it by no means stands alone, and also to reveal that the self-adulation of Western intellectuals is very far from justified on this score and others. There are more subtle and far-reaching illustrations of the conflict between prevailing doctrines and the principles of the Universal Declaration. I don't think any are more important than the process called globalization. In fact, specific form of international integration that should be understood, I think, as a direct assault against democracy and freedom, against both the civil and political and the socioeconomic provisions of the Universal Declaration. That's a large topic, but for some other time. The hopeful element in all of this is that it can all be changed, and pretty easily, without incurring any great personal cost in very free societies like ours. These are not matters of fate. They're not matters of mysterious historical laws, just ordinary will and choice. Thanks.
Thank you for the comprehensive and sobering presentation. We have about 50 minutes for questions. Please, there is no mic, I think, so you have to come in front and then ask the questions. But there is one mic. Good news.
I'll just take it. Why don't you get started? I think people can hear. You got a loud voice.
Two-part question, I'll try to keep it quick. First part is, how do you argue, or do you try to bother with people of the mainstream view that might does equal right, such as my kind of liberal brother-in-law saying in response to the fact that we bombed Al Jazeera, but do you know what kind of horrible things they said on Al Jazeera? So he sort of, and many people internalize that. And the second part, just for people who feel sort of dispirited by sort of the enormity of the sort of changes here and the rollback as it feels of a lot of things, what kind of hope can you offer?
Well, you know, with regard to arguing against people who say that might is right, you shouldn't argue against them. They're correct. You don't argue against the truth. What you do is something quite different. I mean, you ask them, do they really believe in that principle? And I'll bet you, was it your brother or whoever it is? I'm sure he doesn't. You know, if you pursue the question whether he really believes that principle, he'll certainly won't. And then comes the question, well, why do you accept it in this case? But to argue against the truth of it is a mistake, because it in fact is true. That's the way the world works, and will work as long as people let it work that way. As for the rollback, I mean, it's certainly an effort. I mean, in fact, you take it for granted that whenever there's any kind of crisis, those who have power are going to exploit that window of opportunity to, you know, to impose harsh, regressive measures and to follow their natural instincts. In this case, to institute quasi-fascist rules. And yeah, they'll do it if there's an earthquake, and they would do it to exploit the fear and the anguish that followed the atrocities of September 11th. But, you know, yeah, that you expect. The question is, do you accept it? And I don't think it's being all that much accepted. I think the country's a lot more open and resistant than the headlines indicate, so I don't feel really hopeless about that. I think there are plenty of opportunity. In fact, I think there's more openness to discussion of a whole range of issues than there was before September 11th. It's certainly true in my experience, and I heard the same from others. Yeah.
Professor Chomsky, I have listened to you very attentively, and my question would be, from Egyptian Empire to Roman Empire, the British Empire and the present American Empire. To an extent that during the British Empire, Thomas Jefferson claimed that should the British Empire fall or collapse, the world will have peace and justice. Could you tell me, or could you tell us that what America is doing today, others have not done that? And could you tell us that with the Chinese Empire forthcoming, China will not repeat what America is doing? So what is the difference? What is America doing that is different from other empires? Thank you.
What's it done? Nothing much. It's following a very traditional imperial policy. And there are differences. One difference is that unlike the Roman Empire and the Chinese Empire, it's internally free, which means that citizens can do a lot to change it if they decide to. That's a big difference. And in fact have done a lot. So the ability of the US to use violence is far below what it was, say, 40 years ago. For example, I talked about the bombing of South Vietnam and the attack on South Vietnam in the early 60s. This went on for 4 years without a whisper of protest. I mean, until a couple of years after that in Boston, a pretty liberal city, you couldn't have public demonstrations against the war because they'd be broken up violently by students. You know, they attacked churches, I mean, break up meetings on the Boston Common. The press would applaud it. It was wonderful. That was, by that time, hundreds of thousands of people had been killed in South Vietnam. You know, there were a couple 100,000 American troops rampaging there. There's nothing like that's even imaginable today. And it's because of the extent to which the citizens undertook their own responsibilities and put some constraints on the government. Nowhere near enough, but, you know, it's a lot. We shouldn't underestimate it. That's a big difference from other empires. This one can collapse from within, and should. You know.
Professor Chomsky, I'm sure you know the book, The Trial of Henry Kissinger. And first I'd like your comments about the essential accuracy of the thesis. Secondly, does this really mean that he is under some sort of personal risk, as Pinochet was, if it were not for his mental condition, quote unquote, of not being able to travel outside of the U.S.? What does this imply for anyone other than the president?
Well, if you want my opinion on the accuracy, I'll be happy to tell you, but off the record, just in brief, parts of it I think are very accurate. Actually, parts that were lifted from other sources, but and some others are too. But you know, basically the story I think is more or less accurate. Basically, on the other hand, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to charge Henry Kissinger personally. You know, these are not personal matters. Kissinger's role was not different from a long list of other people. He's kind of like easy to attack. He's that type of person. But his record is, his record isn't worse than others. For example, take Moynihan, who I mentioned. Why not attack him? I mean, he describes his own crimes happily, cheerfully. And to go back to the Kennedy administration, I mean, a whole raft of criminals. And it continues. I mean, these are just institutional facts. I don't think that any person in power, with real power, suffers any threat of criminal prosecution, including those who are there right now. I mean, again, let me just repeat that some of this is just entirely uncontroversial. The United States was condemned for international terrorism in one case. By the World Court, and those very same people happen to be implementing policy now. I mean, how can they face any threat if nobody even knows about it or is willing to talk about it? So Kissinger himself is, in my view, pretty insignificant, but in fact, he kind of explained pretty well his own role. He's pretty honest in many ways. He's an expert, and he described the role of the expert as, I wish I could remember the exact words, but the drift was something like this. He said the expert is the person who knows how to articulate the consensus of the powerful. And that's correct. That's what made him an expert. He knew how to articulate the consensus of the powerful. But he didn't have any power. You know, the power, he was representing it and speaking for it. He made decisions, but if he'd made the wrong decisions, he'd be out in his ear. You know? And I think it's kind of misleading to focus on an individual that way, even if the charges are accurate, as to a large extent they are.
Yeah. So you were mentioning earlier that this is an empire that can collapse from within, and I was wondering what, in your opinion, is some steps that we all can take.
Well, I mean, you know, take everything I mentioned today, which is the tip of an iceberg. I mean, that can all be reversed. It doesn't require a revolution. It can be reversed by vote, you know. Of course, to get that far, you have to have education and organization. People have to know about it. I mean, it's all kept secret, you know, for pretty good reasons. It's kept secret because people like your brother, was it, or, you know, brother-in-law, I mean, they find out about it, they're not going to like it, you know. They don't want to be responsible for crimes like that, so it's kept secret. But then that tells you what you can do, prevent it from being secret. That there are easy ways to do that. You can't do it alone, you know, but you can do it in organizations. And that can reach the point where it does impose real constraints on power. Constraints powerful enough to eliminate it. It's a very fragile system. They know it. Now, take, say, the last World Trade Organization meeting last month. It was a good reason why it was held in Qatar. You know, we all know the reason. You know, if they could put it on a space shuttle, they'd put it there. They know perfectly well that it's a very fragile system. There's a huge popular movement opposing all of these investor rights agreements and whatever they're doing, and it can easily erode. I mean, the business press goes berserk when something collapses. So, for example, when the popular opposition forced the OECD to to fail to sign the multilateral agreement on investment. This was April 1998. You take a look at the business press, the Financial Times of London, they were very upset. Big headlines about how hordes of vigilantes have overwhelmed the poor little OECD, the biggest concentration of power in the world. All the rich states, the multinational corporations, overwhelmed by Maud Barlow and 2 or 3 other activists and the people they represented. And that's true. They had to back off over tremendous popular protests. And they were very upset. I mean, they quote trade representatives as saying pretty soon it may not be possible to pass trade agreements in secret and have them rubber stamped by Parliament. I mean, it's a catastrophe, and they know how close that is to realization, just as the constraints on use of violence are very, very fragile, and they know it. I mean, just to give you a last example, when any administration comes into office, the first thing they do is have a big intelligence review. Joint intelligence services give a kind of review of the world situation. And that was done when Bush #1 came into office. And evidently somebody in the Pentagon or State Department or somewhere was unhappy about it and leaked a piece of it, which was kind of hidden away in the bottom of a gossip column by Maureen Dowd in the New York Times, but it was there. It was a passage that said, it dealt with what to do in international confrontations. And here's what it said. It said, in the case of confrontations with a much weaker enemy, meaning any imaginable enemy, in the case of confrontation with a much weaker enemy, we must win decisively and rapidly, because under any other conditions, popular support will erode. Okay, that wasn't true 40 years ago. And if you take a look at the wars of the 1990s, that's what they are. You have to fight totally defenseless enemies from a great distance, and you have to win rapidly and decisively, or else you're in deep trouble. That was not true in the early 1960s. They could go on for years, and nobody cared. Well, okay, that's the way constraints are imposed. Plenty of other examples.
Actually, get a line going.
We can go on for lunch. Yeah.
I'm a Palestinian refugee, and I've just escaped the U.S. foreign policies conducted by its climate regime, Israel. And
you better keep your face hidden, given or John Ashcroft may notice.
Be careful. That's why I actually have a green card. Anyway, I thought that I come to the States, I'll be safe, right? I've escaped the U.S. foreign policies. Yet I find that there is a great convergence between different elements from the right and the left, along with the media, on attacking the Arabs right now by changing the law for what's going to be in the future, a lawful pretext to attack any form of opposition. Just your opinion on how does that violate human rights?
Well, first of all, there's absolutely it obviously violates human rights. There's no need to comment. But the only comment I'll make is that there's absolutely nothing new about it. That's been going on for as long as you want to trace it back. What were the British and the French doing in the Middle East? Handing out candy to babies? No. I mean, like using poison gas, aerial bombardment, all kinds of atrocities. And the U.S. simply took over from them and has been doing the same thing for the last 50 years. In that respect, nothing fundamental's changed. Modalities have changed. I mean, tactics have changed. There's other concerns, but the basic principles remain the same. After all, why is the United States, just take a look at the U.S. relation to Israel. What solidified that relation? Well, you're a Palestinian, you should know. Up until 1967, it was not a particularly close relationship. In fact, support for Israel was very weak in the United States, including those who are the most passionate supporters today. 1967 changed all that, and it established the relationship. And the reason was that in 1967, Israel performed a real service. It destroyed independent, secular Palestinian Arab nationalism, namely Nasser. And that was a real service. Destroying secular nationalism is a major service. Actually, it's had effects, like leading to the rise of religious fundamentalism all over the place. It's one of the things that happens when you destroy secular nationalism. But it was important. Nasser at the time, Nasserite this had nothing to do with whether Nasser was a nice guy or not. He wasn't a horrible guy, but he was representing independent nationalism and non-alignment, and that's unacceptable. Israel destroyed it. He was in fact threatening Saudi Arabia at the time, the real centerpiece of U.S. interests, because that's where the oil is, threatening it in the sense that those ideas might have led to a revolution in Saudi Arabia. That was all finished after '67. Okay, that's when the relationship solidified, and Israel became a partner in the system that includes Turkey and Iran under the Shah, and Pakistan for a while, and trying to control Arab nationalism. Now it's a leading partner. You know, these are just new tactical modifications of traditional policies, actually taken right over from the British.
Professor Chomsky, I have one question for you. Do you think that in the coming weeks, if bombs do fall on Iraq, as it appears that they're going to, do you think that there's going to be more of a stifling of dissent in the United States by the mainstream media, or the media entirely in general?
Well, you know, that's again a matter of choice. You don't have to agree to be stifled. There isn't a lot that they can do to people like us. I mean, if you happen to be an immigrant, there's a lot they can do, you know. If you are a poor kid living in the ghetto, there's a lot they can do. But, I mean, I don't know you, but I guess you're like the rest of us. We're pretty privileged people, meaning very protected. So yes, you don't have to accept stifling of dissent. Sure, there would be an effort. I mean, every time there's a use of violence, there's an effort to stifle dissent for perfectly obvious reasons. I mean, in the case of Iraq, it's kind of worth bearing in mind something that I haven't seen mentioned in the press. Every month in Iraq, every month for the last 10 years, the death toll among children is approximately the same as the number of people killed on September 11th. That's every month, you know, without extensive bombing. I'm not convinced that they're going to go on to bomb, because I think that the costs elsewhere in the region might be considered too high to accept. But if they do, yeah, there'll be an effort which we should resist. Just like we should resist the attempt to extend the bombing.
Can I just say that I wish we could go on forever, but we have some firm requests that we have
Okay,
to
one last.
question.
Professor Chomsky.
Move forward.
Yeah, Professor Chomsky, these days there's a lot of talk about an agenda of human rights that I guess foreign powers want to impose in Afghanistan. I wonder if you could comment on this agenda.
Well, I'm all in favor of human rights in Afghanistan, like everywhere else, but they have to be imposed. But here, I think we ought to follow the lead of the Afghans, and you know, they are not as silent as you might guess from reading the press. So, for example, recently in the last couple of weeks, there's a lot of concern, even Laura Bush, about the rights of women in Afghanistan. Yeah, okay, that's correct. It's a serious problem. Actually, I should say that the rights of women in Afghanistan, which are horrendous, are not very different from much of the rest of Central and South Asia. Not very different. You take a look at the careful analyses of, you know, say parts of India, and it's just kind of like under the Taliban, and it's not the only place. So yeah, it's correct to be concerned about that. There is an organization that is concerned about it, and has been for a long time, RAWA, the Revolutionary Association for the Women of Afghanistan, which has been fighting this battle for 25 years. And it hasn't been an easy one. Their leader was assassinated by an Afghan who was kind of like a KGB agent. They've been fighting under very harsh conditions, and they've had things to say about how this should be handled. They have bitterly condemned the bombardment and have said that the struggle against oppression and violation of women's rights and other rights in Afghanistan should be fought by the Afghan people without their country being destroyed by outsiders who are interested only in killing them, you know. Well, you know, that ought to be a front page headline. If it isn't, we ought to make it that. They're the Afghan people, the defenders of women's rights, not since yesterday, like Laura Bush, but for 25 years, and fighting hard, you know, real struggles. So, like you could argue, maybe they don't know as much about Afghanistan as people who couldn't have placed it on a map 2 months ago. Maybe, but it's not obvious. And they're not the only ones, by any means. So yeah, we should be concerned about human rights in Afghanistan, and it's a problem the Afghans should play the lead in that. And they've been pretty outspoken.